Welcome to Face to Face. My name is Chris Crook, and I'll be sitting in tonight for Jack Etkin. Joining me is Anthony J. Hall. He's a professor of globalization studies at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Hi.
He's also the author of the books The American Empire and the Fourth World, and that's followed by Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization, and Capitalism. Well, Tony, the Bowl with One Spoon series, that title intrigues me. What does that mean? What is the bowl with one spoon?
Well, these two volumes I started 16 years ago, so it's a very elaborate long-term project. The bowl with one spoon is a term to describe an image that appeared repeatedly on wampum belts, shelled belts that indigenous peoples in the northeastern part of North America often used to signify agreements among themselves in treaties, treaties within Aboriginal nationalities or between Aboriginal nationalities. So the bowl with one spoon signifies shared hunting territory. So if your people and my people say, and we lived before 1492 somewhere in northeastern North America, we wanted to signify that we would agree to share hunting territory. The symbol we would put on our wampum belt is the bowl with one spoon. And I pose the bowl with one spoon as an alternative approach to history, an alternative future to what I call the American empire of private property. The United States was founded with this obsession on the idea of private property, putting survey lines around different plots of land, fences, this ownership of the material world and now of the intellectual world, intellectual property, this thrust, we could call this thrust capitalism. And we see the United States throughout much of the 20th century was really the bastion of, the driving force of the military police agency of capitalism. So the resistance of indigenous peoples to the United States, to the expansion of the United States. I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested of the resistance of indigenous peoples all over the planet to these different imperial thrusts emerging first from Western Europe, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Belgian Empire, but then it seems after World War II, the United States kind of moves into the vacuum created by the dismantling of these European empires and becomes this agency of imperial globalization, of sort of hyper-privatization capitalism. And we can see where that led in the financial debacle of 2008, 2009, this obsession with deregulation, privatizing everything. We've got a nuclear plant in Fukushima in Japan, supposedly owned by a private company, being run by a private company on the profit motive. I mean, what insanity, what a travesty, what an assault on the public health of all humanity. So this need to find some sort of explaining principle or theory of opposing this juggernaut of corporate privatization, of corporate capitalism. When I refer to the bowl with one spoon, I'm drawing from the Aboriginal history of North America and trying to use it as a metaphor to help us understand, our resistance struggle, humanity's resistance struggle, that part of humanity who is not willing to accept that this U.S. approach to capitalism or Chinese approach, is at the end of history, represents the end of history. There are alternatives, and the decolonization struggle of indigenous people since 1492, to me, illustrate and point the way towards the future of this struggle.
Well, it's fascinating to me, wampum, in my understanding of the word, and this is emblematic of how history is co-opted by the victors. But wampum, I've always understood to be a currency. But you're saying it's not simply a currency. In fact, it's something we might even call an anti-currency.
Well, the Swedish colonists, there was a New Sweden, the Dutch colonists, New Netherlands, some of the English colonists, they lacked capital, they lacked currency in their communities, so they adopted wampum shells as currency. So it is an interesting variation on the theme, but in the purest sense, wampum are belts, shelled belts, with pictorial representations on them. And they're sacred, they're ways of recording agreements, of perpetuating the understanding and passing on the understanding of agreements. So I think there's a great deal we can learn from indigenous peoples. That we have learned in the past and could continue to learn. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas were fantastic in agriculture, and many of the food sources that we now take for granted, corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, potatoes. I mean, you think of potatoes, you think of Ireland, but no, the potatoes come from the Andean cultures, in the Incan cultures in the Andean mountains. Corn is transformed the political economy of the world. It's such a rich source of food. Tremendous emphasis on biodiversity. And a major theme I follow throughout both these volumes is that the need for biological diversity, so life can renew itself. There's an equivalent there of the need for cultural diversity. So we have many different ways of viewing what's going on the planet, that we have, we inherit thousands of languages, thousands of indigenous traditions, and that's part of the commonwealth, the human richness of humanity. And we're sacrificing, just like we're sacrificing biological diversity, we're sacrificing cultural diversity for monocultures, and capitalism is a kind of monoculture. It doesn't allow for a lot of diversity. It pushes things into narrower and narrower channels of development. You get the certain kind of chicken that grows quickly, and then you replicate that. You get the certain kind of corn that grows quickly. I guess you get the certain kind of labor or worker that acts obediently, and our education system can be violating these principles of diversity. So that's an underlying theme as well.
The monopolization of agriculture and monoculture, as you describe it, there's also the monopolization of history. And we don't understand this, especially the settlers, descendants of the settlers like you and I are here in North America. And I'll read something from a great favorite of mine. Kurt Vonnegut, the great American novelist, in his book Breakfast of Champions, he wrote of 1492, the contact year. He says, as children, we were taught to memorize this year with pride and joy as the year people began living full and imaginative lives on the continent of North America. But actually, people had been living full and imaginative lives on the continent of North America for hundreds of years before that. 1492 was simply the year sea pirates began to rob, cheat, and kill them. How is our understanding today of the history, our shared history here in North America, and especially as it pertains to our relations with the indigenous peoples, the first peoples, how does that form our current society, and how do we move forward without addressing the wrongs done and the things that we can learn as well?
I put a great deal of emphasis on the idea of globalization since 1492 in these studies. So Columbus, he's a pirate of sorts, but he has a view that the world is round. He's going to head west instead of east to get to the Orient. And it turns out that he's correct in his theory that the world is round. He thought he got to India. He called the people he met Indians. We still have this confusion in our society about East India and the West Indies. So, it's quite instructive that a mistake going back to 1492 can be perpetuated in the language. Of course, that's ethnocentric. The Chinese were exploring throughout the planet in the early 1400s. Something happened and they turned inward. So the Arabs conducted all kinds of reconnaissances, and when they got to what they now call Indonesia, that part of the world, the Indians, the people from India, the Arabs were deeply engaged in trade in that area. But, this European, this amazing expansionary force that emanates from Western Europe starting in 1492, it really is an amazingly aggressive, forceful, military, violent form of expansion that imposes itself on pretty much everybody in the planet, indigenous peoples throughout the planet. So that to me is the beginning of imperial globalization. Then, of course, peoples have to resist this in different ways, and it's difficult to resist as, say, an individual Blackfoot or a Haida, or in Africa or India, you know, to resist as small community groups, ethnic groups, tribal groups. So there's a need to create bigger and bigger confederacies of resistance, reaching a peak, I think, in Bandung in 1955, where you had the founding of the non-aligned movement. Indigenous peoples, all of them having been colonized by Europeans and realizing in 1955 this bipolarism of the Cold War, this idea that the world would be divided between two systems, the US-led capitalist dynamic and the Soviet-led communist dynamic. As early as 1955, indigenous peoples are coming together in Bandung in Indonesia and saying this is another form of colonization. We have our own indigenous traditions, philosophies, heritages. This is the philosophy that a British Columbian Indian, a Shuswap Indian by the name of George Manuel, he writes a book, The Fourth World, and says we're going to proceed based on our own indigenous understandings. We're not going to accept that we only have two options, capitalism versus socialism, Soviet-led empire versus US-led empire. So the Fourth World to me is another key to this history of decolonization, that I think people of all backgrounds, we can join together. I mean, now that the Soviet system is no more, and it seems that there is an opening for the universalization of capitalism, for multinational companies to become truly global companies. You know, what strategy of resistance do we adopt? So I'm proposing the Fourth World, the bowl with one spoon, this history of anti-imperial globalization, where indigenous peoples have created larger and larger confederacies of resistance that trade unions, women's groups, religious groups, people interested in a more progressive humanitarian approach to civil society, that we need metaphors, we need ways to organize ourselves, and we need to be able to put these struggles in the context of history. I mean, watching the Battle of Seattle in 1999, as I was working on these volumes, I thought to myself, well, there's a movement, a new movement, you know, the Teamsters and the Turtles, the ecologists and the trade unionists, all people organizing in 1999 to show opposition to the World Trade Organization and passing over so many new powers to this sort of group of companies, big companies who pretty much own and control the national governments these days, the governments of the nation states. So there's this convergence of activist energies, but we need a conception of history. We have to have some sense of where we're coming from and how we can unify, how we can connect up, we can create confederacies of resistance and transcend narrow ethnicities and xenophobias and look to our common attributes as human beings to oppose this juggernaut of militarism. I don't think there has been a time in history where we've seen organized crime on this level, this military, this combination of companies, corporate power, which is seeking to completely obliterate governments and pretty well organize the whole world according to very violent principles. We're on the frontiers of the privatized terror economy. Maybe we're deep into the privatized terror economy. A symbol of this, I think, is George Bush. George Bush, is a figurehead, but he was the signing authority during a period which witnessed, the 9/11 wars, the inception of the 9/11 wars. George Bush, incredibly, is coming to Vancouver, coming to Surrey on October the 20th. So just earlier, a few days ago, and that's why I'm in the province now, we organized at Surrey, at the Surrey City Hall, calling attention to Mayor Diane Watts, who, showing incredible bad judgment, invited George Bush and Bill Clinton to Surrey to talk about quote-unquote economic development. We can imagine the type of economic development that George Bush brings along with him. You know, drug deals, mercenary soldiers, as I say, or organized crime at the highest level, false flag operations. Who really seriously accepts any longer that Osama Bin Laden and some dudes in caves in Afghanistan made the whole 9/11 event happen? I mean, incredible period of corruption. Our mainstream media has been bad in the past, but now it is completely a mouthpiece of this war machine, of this organized crime cabal. So in British Columbia here on October 20th, there's a bit of a point of reference here where we have to, draw the line and demonstrate, as we did in Calgary in 2009. Of course, Splitting the Sky was arrested, attempting a citizen's arrest of George W. Bush. So that history is now transferred, or is now unfolding in Vancouver, and I hope the activist community, the progressive community in British Columbia will get organized, and we'll do what we can. Joshua Blakeney and I just put a YouTube up on this action that we did in Surrey the other day. So I like to combine history with looking at contemporary issues, and that's what I'm attempting to do here.
Well, it's often said that the price of empire is that the empire falls back on itself, and the tools that it employs on those that it would subjugate overseas are used on the people at home eventually. I wonder if we're not coming to that point now here, and we're seeing maybe a time when the term indigenous has to be, in the context of colonization at least, has to be redrawn and reconsidered when we find ourselves under an occupation of sorts by our own people, as we saw at the G20 in the summer in Toronto last year, or as we see even today here in early May in Victoria, where there's an American warship berthed here, and the streets are filled with American soldiers.
Yeah, indigenous peoples is a tricky term. I use it to apply to basically 3/4 of the world's population. This huge expansionary impetus, this force out of Western Europe to colonize parts of the planet in Africa, much of Africa, excluding South Africa, it didn't involve a big migration of people. In Asia, it didn't involve a big migration of people, but here in North America or in Australia, it did involve a big migration. So we live in a milieu where the indigenous peoples are a small minority. They've been overwhelmed by this migration from Europe. But really, the position of indigenous peoples in North America who see imperialism and colonization as a force coming at them, a force which narrows horizons, a force of implosion in a sense, quite different than those who might see, the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the development of places like British Columbia as a kind of opening of opportunity and new capital for the system, new currency and riches to build up this system of global capitalism. I mean, the majority of people on the planet don't see it that way. They see empire building as a force coming at them, undermining their indigenous laws, languages, customs, ways of living in relationship to the productive forces of the land, the renewing life forces of Mother Earth. So, I've tried to expand this idea of indigenous peoples and suggest that, we're human beings. We have free will. We don't, just by the accident of our birth, we're not compelled to follow a certain trajectory of history. So the fact that we can identify with the indigenous peoples and their struggle, and we can develop a better Canada, a better British Columbia by seeing that the old promises and legal principles going back to, say, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that our governments live up to them and respect the rule of law. So we found ourselves in Surrey the other day with, vis-a-vis George Bush's visit, saying we want the government of Canada to respect the rule of law, to enforce the Canadian Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. We're not proposing, the overthrow of the rule of law. We want simply law enforcement officials to respect the rule of law, when it comes to Aboriginal title and Indian rights, and not be criminalizing Indigenous peoples. Pretty ugly when you see the criminalization of, splitting the sky, for example, and hundreds and thousands of Indigenous peoples who fill our jails, and George Bush and men and women of his ilk, primarily men, are above the law, clearly are not subjected to the enforcement of, say, the Canadian Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, which was passed in 2000. So this need to know our history, to draw what is good from our history. I mean, I think Canada has a heritage which could be give us a very fine, noble position in the world if we could work out the relationship with Indigenous peoples and the way of sharing resources. For instance, in British Columbia, maybe we could apply that in the Middle East to Palestine, Israel. We could draw in this history to make our country a beacon and an example, and to give some hope. And if we were to arrest George Bush here in British Columbia when he comes on October the 20th and put in motion a proper procedure, I'm not saying George Bush is guilty yet. He hasn't had a trial. I'm still of the school that we treat people as innocent until proven guilty. I certainly want to hear George Bush's defense. I want to hear Dick Cheney's defense. I want to hear Condoleezza Rice's defense. I want to hear Wolfowitz's defense. I want them to have the best opportunity to tell their side of the story. And what I suspect it would come down to is 9/11. Oh, we weren't doing aggressive war, torture, and all these things that we're being accused of. We were defending our people. We had to do this. And this is why 9/11 truth, the quest for 9/11 truth, is so crucial, and why it's so disappointing that such important elements of the anti-war movement have essentially gone AWOL, are not present to deal with, any situation where you're anti-war and you're dealing with the nature of warfare. You've got to look at the origins of that war. How did that war come about? What happened on 9/11? Until we get into that, until we come up with a better interpretation than we've been given by the mainstream media, who disgrace themselves every day, who expose themselves for millions and millions of people as nothing but propaganda agencies in the in the tradition of Pravda, the worst kind of totalitarian regimes that we've seen. Now we have this whole Bin Laden psychological operation. Anybody serious who's looked at these issues that I know believes that Bin Laden died a long time ago. So that person killed the other day and called Geronimo, ironically or revealingly or tellingly, that's not the same Bin Laden that they were pointing to. That's some other character that has been made to fit the bill. But exactly what happened, now we have a whole other layer of lies. And this seems to be leading towards the demonization of Pakistan. Webster Tarpley's view is that Brzezinski, they're saying this whole diversion into Iran and the Arab world, this was leading away from the big issues of geopolitics, which is relations with China, with Russia, the symmetry, where is the U.S. going to be in the future of Eurasia? And he's been saying, the agenda is war with Pakistan. Pakistan is very aligned with China. And Pakistan, just like Afghanistan, is key to the roots of these pipelines. And so it looks like the way this is being played, this killing of Obama kills Osama. I'm thinking there's a good YouTube title. Obama kills Osama. It seems to be a prelude to demonize Pakistan, to say Pakistan was running Osama bin Laden. Pakistan is got to be taken out. Tarpley's been saying the agenda is to balkanize it, to transform it into belittle polities, to build up ethnic tension and conflict along the way, and somehow preempt this alliance with China. And of course, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Is the plan to go in and snatch those nuclear weapons? It's amazing just how history is unfolding at breakneck speeds right now. And I'll want to at some point talk about what's going on at Fukushima, but I'll maybe.
Like you, I'd like to hear Osama Bin Laden rather's defense too. I follow that quaint idea that we're a nation of laws, and that one of the centerpieces of that law, beyond habeas corpus, is the tenet that people are innocent until proven guilty. And when you mention the media, I hear this on the CBC, where it's taken as a given that Osama bin Laden was responsible for 9/11. A rather testy prime minister, Stephen Harper, when he was still in the minority, snapped at a reporter asking about 9/11, or about Afghanistan rather, Canada's continued involvement was because of 9/11, and yet Canada has never mounted an investigation of the between 20 and 30 Canadians that were killed that day at the World Trade Center. But getting back to the occupation, a lot of people here in British Columbia feel occupied right now, and with the ascension of a majority Tory government led by Stephen Harper, that feeling is only intensified. Tony, in your province in Alberta, just last week there was a massive pipeline spill. It was covered up for 2 or 3 days before it was even reported, and even now there's very little information coming out about that. The company has just sort of said, oh yeah, we're sorry, it's all under control, don't worry, change the channel, basically, is what they're saying. We're looking at here in British Columbia the proposal of Enbridge, a massive pipeline project that promises to snake right across from east to west our entire province, covering thousands of watersheds and creeks, and going through native lands that have never been ceded by treaty at all. And yet we're promised from the East and from the press that this is going to go ahead, not to worry on the stock market. Enbridge's stock is rising all the time. How do we resist? How do we legally resist forces that don't seem to respect laws that go against their interests?
Yeah, of course, the Enbridge pipeline is to export oil and gas from the tar sands to China, to the Orient, to get a pipeline going from the tar sands to the Pacific. And when James Cameron came into Fort McMurray in Edmonton, I was part of that group that was around him. I talked with Indian leader in Kitimat, and he was talking about it's not only to export oil and gas to the West, but it's to bring in a certain type of chemical that is used in the tar sands, a very toxic, highly dangerous, inflammable chemical. So we don't get the full story on these things. You have to go out and think for yourself and do research on the internet. Thankfully, we have the internet. I mean, we live in an era where the key person at CBC, the anchor, Peter Mansbridge, and he was a baggage carrier. He was a baggage official in Churchill. He did some announcing in Churchill, and somebody thought he had a nice voice. He's not an educated person. And there he is in this key place. But you can see that the media really don't like to hire educated people. We get sort of clowns like Rex Murphy, cute little Newfoundlander. But if you really listen to his analysis, it's always apologetics for the United States. It's always pro-war agenda. And so we live in a time of this enormous corruption, and really the key agencies of the military-industrial complex these days are these media cartels, which in order to conduct war using drones and depleted uranium, and somehow you have to dehumanize the people that you're targeting, and so that's what we see constantly going on in the media now, talking about the importance of drawing the line at George Bush. And arresting George Bush. This is not to say that all the corruption that comes out of the executive branch of the U.S. government. I mean, the most lying, least reliable agency in the world right now must be the U.S. commander-in-chief. I mean, it's just nothing but a constant flow of lies, and all the expanded power of the executive branch as the war agency of the United States. I mean, Obama has clearly moved into that. He clearly is a vehicle of an expression of the corruption of the mainstream media, the lying of the mainstream media. He shows himself to be completely subservient to the forces of Wall Street. The same people that were there when Bush ran his mess, ran the economy in the ground, when the Reaganist kleptocracy, theft of the executive branches of these companies became so great that the system just froze up. The people in charge, the Wall Street people, the Goldman Sachs people, the AIG, was a key player in this, as I describe in Earth into Property. Obama is clearly subject to and subordinate to those White House interests, and when it comes to the military-industrial complex, he's clearly subordinate to agencies that more or less give him his orders. In fact, one of the analyses is that on this killing of Osama Bin Laden, this quote-unquote killing of Osama Bin Laden, Obama was not really on side with it. He was simply ordered that he's going to do this. So dealing with the lies that start with the executive branch of the U.S. government and its puppet regimes, like the Harper regime in Canada, who simply are getting their messages from the public relation companies that do the White House in Washington, do the Parliament in Ottawa. Stephen Harper is not really in control. He's obviously as much a puppet as Obama is. So we have to look higher in the feeding chain, and fortunately we have the internet, and we have an unprecedented era where we can inform ourselves on the internet and create alternative media on the internet, and of course this type of show is connected to alternative media, but. From time to time, we have to get out in the streets. We can't just be in the sort of comfort of Facebook. And
well, we saw in Toronto what happens when people go out into the streets. I mean, peaceful or not, the state, with agence provocateur and other means, are determined to create violent situations, which of course is their bailiwick. Violence seems to be the organizing principle of the world these days. So how is there a resistance? I understand too that the Harper regime has a bill pending any day now to erase a lot of the freedom of the internet through the employment of hate laws.
No, it's going to be coming at us fast and furious. When you watch the G20 protest, I was not in Toronto, but when you watch, for instance, those police cars burning, it was almost like, did they have gas? Like barbecue type situations inside. I mean, so who abandons like a police car? Like when we go to the airport, they say don't abandon your baggage. So who is going to leave a police car open and unattended? That was clearly bait of some sort. So when we look at what's going on in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, when we look at what went on at Tahrir Square, when we look at what's going on in Syria. I mean, this movement, I don't see this as specific to Arab and Muslim people. It starts there. I'd like to think that we're living in a time where the Tahrir Square freedom movement is a sort of anti-authoritarian movement, is moving through society. These elections that we just went through, happening concurrently with the biggest nuclear, is it an accident? But let's call it an accident. Fukushima of all times. It's, enormous public health implications for everybody in the planet. Why isn't Honshu Island being evacuated? Are the Japanese just being left there? Is this a continuation of the kind of racism that we saw with Hiroshima and Nagasaki? So here we're one of the most nuclearized jurisdictions in the world, Canada. A lot of that uranium comes at Fukushima in the form of the uranium processed into fuel rods, including plutonium-laced MOX fuel rods that were in reactor 3 when it blew up. This comes from Canada. Ontario is one of the most nuclearized jurisdictions in the world. And we have an election, no discussion on that. We have an election as we're involved in the attacks on Libya. And if that isn't a psy-op, it was obviously an agreement between the three main parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the New Democrats. Let's not talk about Fukushima. Let's not talk about war. And the media were complicit as well. So to me, what legitimacy does an election like this have, where such big global issues are unfolding, and there's this elite accommodation agreement that there will be no real debate on these big contemporary issues. You know, we're past the point of saying that, you know, it's just a matter of where you put your X on a ballot. We need much more direct action. We need the kind of expression we saw in Egypt. I mean, the resistance to Mubarak. Yeah, so you're against Mubarak and the autocracy and top-down corruption of Mubarak. Who put Mubarak there? Mubarak is obviously a middle manager. He's handling Egypt for a larger cabal of organized crime, and it goes back to Imperial Washington. It goes back to Imperial Tel Aviv and the links between them. So in resisting Mubarak's dictatorship in Egypt, I mean, we've got to resist the whole system that put a Mubarak in place, that puts these dictators. You know, look at the history of the removal of Sukarno and the replacement of Sukarno with Suharto in Indonesia, and the murder, outright murder of 1 million people to go along with that, especially in the PKI. You know, East Timor. Look at Chile and taking out Allende and putting in place Augusto Pinochet. You know, the list just goes on and on. Iran, taking out, putting in the Shah of Iran in place of Mossadegh. I mean, the history of regime change and imperial globalization focused on the military-industrial complex of the United States. You know, Mubarak was just an expression of a very, very long line of this kind of thing that continues, given the reality, the games that are being played, the psy-op of Libya, what's taking place in Bahrain, the fact that the Saudi Arabian autocrats and dictators, you know, aren't subjected to the same type of analysis and attacks as the Gaddafi regime. I mean, Gaddafi was the leader of a decolonization, anti-imperial globalization movement. He's Pan-African. Man, if I could have him lecture in my class, I mean, that man has a tremendous depth of understanding of the workings of imperialism. Not to say he didn't make deals with the devil at different points. Do we have any way to know that person who is being called Gaddafi isn't an impersonator, that the real Gaddafi didn't actually go to Venezuela as he was reported to have to do so? Osama Bin Laden, how many people have played that role? How many people have been cast in that role? You know, the psychological operations, the black operations, with 9/11 as the core one, as the most ambitious psychological operations of all time. I mean, imagine the discussion where the sort of advertising types, public relations types, Madison Avenue types saying, man, if those towers come down on live TV, there will be such trauma in the population, such disorientation, that we'll have a license to do war anywhere we want, to take away civil liberties and put the Patriot Act in. I mean, the Patriot Act, a very elaborate piece of legislation, all ready to go. You couldn't come up with that in a few days following 9/11. The invasion plans of Afghanistan, all ready to go. The argument that it was a failure of intelligence, but then nobody gets fired, nobody is held accountable if that's the explanation. The fact that the progressive left, so many parts of the progressive left, refused to deal with this 9/11 issue and left it the way it is, where, you know, we have a tremendous citizens movement on the internet exposing it as sort of the big lie. You know, it's like all over the place. Average people who are well informed but not necessarily paid to be pundits or professors. Average working people say, you know, we're lied to all the time. We know that. But this particular category of lies is so enormous, it's so consequential, it's been used in such diabolical ways that we're not going to allow this particular category of lies in and around the 9/11 debacle to pass. And we're going to hold Peter Mansbridge accountable. And we're going to, you know, Peter Mansbridge has lots to account for in terms of, you know, we talk about war crimes and George Bush, all this complicity in the media, the failure to ask the obvious questions on 9/11, and then every day after, you know, watching the television with every story premised underneath it is that the biggest problem in the world is Al-Qaeda. Never any clear history of Al-Qaeda, that it's, you know, created by the CIA. It's was the Mujahideen to put an anti-Soviet fighting force in place in Afghanistan to take out the Soviet-backed puppet regime in Afghanistan. That's where Al-Qaeda comes from. The idea that, you know, university professors on the take, you know, all through our campuses, that it's lucrative to go along with these lies and crimes of 9/11. You can get research contracts, and it's obviously not a good career move to go into these channels of history. I mean, it creates a huge crisis for the academy and a loss of credibility. I'd have to say, you know, we've failed in the academy, and I'm in the academy, and I accept, you know, the responsibility, some of the responsibility for that failure. So these volumes, this American Empire in the Fourth World, this is before my sort of 9/11 awakening. Barry Zwicker, however, he included it in one of his documentaries. I think it's called The Great Conspiracy. He included the American Empire in the Fourth World and did a little segment on it. So I guess he recognized I was a truther before I fully did. But Earth into Property, I do go into 9/11. Obviously, it's a much bigger story. I see the 9/11 wars, what I'm calling the 9/11 wars, as an extension of the Indian Wars. That essentially, these are resource grabs from indigenous peoples. And it's never presented, well, we're going in to do genocide of the indigenous peoples because we want the resources. No, it's to advance Christianity, advance civilization over savagery. You know, in today's terms, it's to advance democracy. But you know, it really goes back to this same justification for imperial wars and resource grabs that we've been seeing since 1492. So, you know, I've presented an interpretation of the 9/11 wars that goes right back to the westward expansion of the United States, the decision of some in Anglo-America not to adhere to the rule of law in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, but simply depend on conquest, the westward expansion of the United States against the resistance of Indian nations. And in a few instances, those Indian nations had the backing of the British imperial government, War of 1812 and Tecumseh. So that's a, you know, we should be acknowledging and embracing Tecumseh as one of the founders of Canada, as you know, the defenders of Canada. What a great thing if we could incorporate in our national imagination recognition, and this, I'm not making this up, you read this in the American Empire in the Fourth World in detail about, you know, what went on in the War of 1812 and how ideological it really was, and how the question of how indigenous peoples would relate to the international laws and international community. You know, this is a history that we can really, I think, embrace, that we could build a decent Canada by embracing this history. But this alternative, you know, the American empire of private property, this thrust of privatizing things, but not just privatizing as individuals, but creating these corporate bodies. And that, you know, there's a lot of legal history here to create corporations as if they are natural persons. So they have the rights of persons to sue, to be sued, to make contracts, But companies, of course, they're not like human beings. They're not biological. They don't, we run out of steam. We get arthritis. We, have to deal with personal trauma and whatnot as human beings. Obviously, corporate polities, as long as they're making profits, they can kind of transcend biology. So the human persons have become subordinate to the corporate persons, and that history now is just being replicated and globalized, but it's really becoming a military thrust. It's all about this part of the economy in the United States, the military part of the economy, which was given preeminence after 1941, the decision to go to war in the Second World War. The U.S. has simply retained its permanent war economy since 1941 and continues to build it up and build it up. Eisenhower, when he was retiring, said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." Imagine what he would say now. So, this privatized terror economy has become such a overwhelming part of the overall political economy that it's become a sort of unaccountable juggernaut of its own, and citizens can't seem to stop it. So taking a stand, for instance, on enforcing the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act in Canada on George W. Bush on October 20, coming here, in Surrey and Vancouver, in the larger, greater Vancouver region. We can do things to indicate we're part of the Tahrir Square movement. We can't take it anymore. We can't stomach it anymore. The Mubaraks and the oppression represented by Mubarak is, that oppressiveness works here in our own societies. I don't see this current government of Canada is really legitimate, given the failure during the last election to talk about the big global issues and what it demonstrates about the complicity of the media and the elite structures of these parties to sort of evade the real hard issues of our time.
Well, the failure is theirs, it's ours as well. I mean, the fact that Clinton and Bush, the former Republican and Democrat, I mean, they can go on a hand-holding tour to basically raise money and collect, I would assume, favors owed to them for policies that they fronted in the past. Tells us a lot about the kind of governments we have nowadays. In this country, Mr. Harper is hand in glove with these people. He's the agent of militarization in Canada. He's signing on, despite the fact that drone technology seems to be the future of warfare in the 21st century. Mr. Harper would gift billions to the American military industrial complex for these F-35 jets that received, as you mentioned, very little talk. To Mr. Ignatieff's credit, he did say jets and prisons. Prisons is the other thing, too. There seems to be a terrible wheel of history at work here. You mentioned Fukushima and the great disaster, ongoing disaster in Japan. Here in the first week of May in 2011, the reactors continue to smolder and spew, despite having fallen completely off the media radar. But it interests me that the uranium, as you mentioned, a lot of it is sourced from Canada. A lot of it is mined in native lands or near them, just as we dump the awful refuse of our society near the natives and other people that don't represent the ruling elite racially. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, of course. The way I look at
it, a terrible cycle here.
Yeah, the way I look at it, all lands of North America are native lands, or Indian lands, or Inuit lands, or all lands of the Western Hemisphere, for that matter. You raise Fukushima. We don't hear anything coherent from our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, on Fukushima. We don't really hear anything coherent from Barack Obama on Fukushima. Of course, Barack Obama is bought and paid for by the nuclear industry. He's, he gets a lot of financial support from there. He's essentially a lobbyist for the nuclear energy industry. The nuclear energy industry and the nuclear weapons industry are the same thing. I mean, the so-called peaceful use of atomic energy creates plutonium. So, we see how Israel responds when Iran builds a a nuclear energy plant. We see what India did. I mean, you build the nuclear energy plants to create plutonium to put in your nuclear weapons. These industries go back. It's very tragically poetic that Fukushima is happening in the country of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on March 28th, I had out a major article called From Hiroshima to Fukushima, 1945 to 2011. And so the research that in the Manhattan Project that resulted in the first atomic bomb, I mean, that research kept going after 1945, and the first thing they tried to apply it to was nuclear submarines. I had not realized until I did this research, nuclear submarines in World War II could only go about 20 miles underwater. They could only go on battery power. You can't run a diesel engine underwater. You need oxygen. So Rickover, Admiral Rickover, was put in charge of the quest to find, to adapt the same forces that had been embodied in the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He applied that same technology to running a nuclear submarine. In the process, he created something called, he and General Electric created something called the Mark I system. Now at Fukushima #1, the reactors there are the same reactors. They are based on the prototype of the reactor that went into the Nautilus submarine that started operating in 1954. So imagine that the technology there goes back to the early 1950s. When I started to look at Fukushima and say, my God, it's a nuclear waste dump. They've been collecting nuclear waste there for 40 years. I participated, 20 years ago in the process in Ontario where they're saying, where are we going to put the nuclear waste? Everywhere where they try to put it, people mobilize. So they end up just holding it at the nuclear power plants themselves in these large pools. I was surprised and shocked to see that the Mark I system has these nuclear fuel rod pools right on top of the reactors. So if there is a problem in one system, it spreads to the other system. And I realized, oh my God, the reason for this is because that's the way it was designed for the nuclear submarine, where you have a very constrained space. So this is industry. I mean, General Electric, who developed the Mark I, also developed the Fat Man and Little Boy. Those are the colloquial terms. How revealing that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It looks like, just as the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the basis of a huge science experiment on human subjects after 1945. So the people of Honshu Island are now being the subjects of a huge science experiment. These meltdowns and reactions, there's so many compressed nuclear waste pools, processing facilities, nuclear reactors, 6 of them sitting right there. If you get a problem in one, and then it's going to spread to the other. The whole dynamic of nuclear power is chain reactions. That situation in Fukushima is out of control. TEPCO, that little corrupt privatized company, this is way beyond its capacity. All the private companies involved in this business, they all have no liability. The public, they can't get insurance because it's so dangerous. So again and again, in the financial debacle, I mean, it's always say the taxpayer and government is no good. It's got to be minimized and put to the side. This Reagan-esque emphasis on privatization, deregulation, but when a problem arises, stick it to the taxpayer, to the average people. So stick it to the Japanese taxpayer. But how did Japan get 55 nuclear plants on the most dangerous earthquake tsunami zone in the world? What a demonstration of a deregulated industry, of a cowboy industry, no responsibility and no accountability there. So, you would get from the mainstream media that maybe Fukushima is a past event. No, this is underway. This is current. This is contemporary, and this will be going for decades. There's no real solution being offered by TEPCO. I mean, we should be seeing probably the only agency with the real capacity to deal with this would be the U.S. military, which since Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been studying radioactivity, has technology to cope with radioactivity, to operate things and have human beings.
We would hope that they do. I mean, they say that they do, but
well, and let's see it. Let's see the military, rather than being, that this cancer put upon us, reaching into our pockets, saying, yeah, we've got to pay for depleted uranium and fighter jets and aircraft carriers, and we've got to, just enrich this little cabal who, become fabulously wealthy based on this industry, that you can't use it, because if you do use it, you're going to destroy humanity. But now we need it. And where was the Army Corps of Engineers in the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico? We need the state here. We need a major agency to go in, an international agency, not leave it to a little corrupt company, TEPCO. This is all our public health. This is I had to think twice about coming here to the West Coast, knowing the radiation levels in California and British Columbia coming out of Fukushima. But then, when you think about it, really the priority has to be, what about the Japanese? Why aren't we evacuating large numbers of Japanese? This idea that, it's only dangerous 20 kilometers out or 30 kilometers out, when we see the French pulling their people out of 100 kilometers, the U.S. pulling their people out of 100 kilometers, nothing from Stephen Harper, just closed mouth there. But, the idea that you pull out basically the white people and leave the Japanese behind, is there racism going on here? Is this replication? How was it okay to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Would they have dropped it on Germany? Or, it wasn't to really defeat the Japanese, it was to send a signal, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the Soviet Union. So the people of Japan were just sacrificed. I think it's one of the most disgraceful moments I've seen in my lifetime, the failure of the world to respond adequately to what's going on in Japan. When you think of those TEPCO workers, and they essentially use slave labor.
This is the power company that runs that
runs
reactors.
Fukushima #1, the Tokyo Power Company. And they hire people for $200 a day, apparently homeless, vagrant people that they can get to go into these things. So, that's just not acceptable. And the failure, and then we think. And by the way, those people who are dealing with this, they just lived through the biggest earthquake imaginable, the biggest tsunami, and we want them now to fix up the whole legacy that really, it goes back. It wasn't like a political decision of the Japanese people to have this. This was imposed on them in the early 1950s in the Cold War. As I went into researched this, I found, so much of what is going on in Japan now goes back to the deals that were made in the prison with the Class A war criminals in Tsukumo prison in Tokyo, where the Zaibatsu sort of elites of the Imperial Japan, it was recognized, or it was seen, or postulated that this would be the group that would be necessary to use as bastions of anti-communism in the containment policy. And the first recipient of the TV license for Nippon Television, Shoriki Matsutaro, he promoted nuclear energy. He became the first commissioner of Japanese nuclear energy. He brought over promoters of nuclear energy and publicized Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, which was used as a kind of propaganda ploy.
Well, clearly, Professor Hall, this, as I said, this is a cyclical thing, and it's coming around, and it's coming around in the most horrible way with this radioactive poison that is covering the entire globe. And if we allow these things to be built in somebody else's backyard, it's no guarantee that we are not going to suffer the consequences of it.
It's a guarantee. It's a certainty. I mean, there's similar plants in California on earthquake zones.
Well, and in Canada, this is a debate too. But sadly, we don't have time to get into the Canadian aspect of this today. But I implore you to check out Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization, and Capitalization. That's
and
Anthony.
Capitalism, yeah.
Capitalism, I beg your pardon. Freudian slip. that is Professor Anthony J. Hall's latest book, and thank you for watching Face to Face.